Nabeel, thank you so much for joining me on the Pantrium show today.
Thanks. Really nice to join you, Christie.
Of course, it's been a while since we first had a conversation, but I am really looking forward to diving into your experience, your career journey. And, we both are enthusiasts about the fancy title of embedded finance, about what that all means. But one thing we are going to talk about is the concept about strategy, from strategy to execution, among other things. But before we get into that, I ask all my guests to introduce themselves with a fun fact, and you are not going to skip it. So,
Okay.
what's your fun fact?
Yeah, I guess there's probably a spectrum of fun, but I mean, I live in Copenhagen. I was born in London. I consider myself quite the city dweller. In that sense, I could only really live in capital cities, maybe even. But the interesting thing about myself is that I like trekking and hiking. So every now and then, every couple of years, I will escape to the mountain somewhere. And in my life, I've been to Mont Blanc, not necessarily the peak of it. I've been to the
Really?
Himalayas and I've been to Patagonia. So that's my fun fact.
Wow.
I really like hiking, even though I could never exist in an environment outside of a capital city.
You have the complete opposites, the crazy city life, but then you can kind of pull yourself away and then go up to the mountains in silence and beautiful views and just be in nature.
Yeah, it might be even if you think of them as two extremes, it's the thing that keeps me centered in daily life.
I like that. I'm myself also a big hiker on holidays, so I can relate.
Yeah, exactly.
I wanted to talk to you about your career and understanding a little bit more about how you got to the point where you are today. And I wanted to ask you, if you take a moment and think back, do you remember a certain turning point in your career that led you to where you are today?
I think there's probably many turning points. If you think of your life as a decision tree, it's like a point here, and then you have two other options, or maybe more, and then you go from point to point. But I started my career as a management consultant or strategy consultant, fresh out of university in London, mainly working with financial services clients, actually, which is sort of where I am today, again, in financial services. I think I was quite quickly able to figure out, and this is probably a theme in my career if I look back on it, is figuring out how much I want to know and experience of something, and then make a decision to leave that at the right point in time where I think I've learned enough, not necessarily perfected it. And I've done that at probably each stage of my career. So looking at as a consultant, I spent about 2.5 years building what people call the core consulting toolkit, let's say. Building strong logic, knowing how to present well, and that comes out in two ways, literally PowerPoint slides, and then, of course, knowing how to talk through them and navigating an organization. And after about 2.5 years, I decided for myself that I think that's enough strategy consulting.
That's enough.
Before I try something specific.
Yeah.
And so I decided to leave, and I joined Visa, actually Visa Inc., or that's what it's called now. At that point in time, it's called Visa Europe, in London, in their strategy team. And then again, I spent another 2.5 years there learning about the payments industry. And then after 2.5 years, I thought, okay, now it's 5 years of strategy work. I think that's enough to know strategy for life. Maybe I'm wrong. And then I thought, okay, I want to try something more execution oriented. And then I joined the product team at Nets, which was also the transition I made from London to Copenhagen. And I've not looked back since. And for me, those two themes now persist in my life, like strategy and product, which I sort of put under the umbrella of execution. And I think it would have instinctively said knowing when to quit, but quit in a good way, knowing when is the right time to move on to something new, to push yourself to a new challenge. It's something I've always been quite aware of, even early in my career. Okay, I think I got 80% of what I need to know here. I could stay for much longer and then go on the long 20% tail where it takes maybe 4 years to get to the next 18, 19%, or I can try something new and then build up again another 2.5, 3 years of something new where I think it adds to my skill set. Yeah. And that's the key thing.
You got your consultancy toolkit, you understand strategy. What made you move to product of all things?
Yeah. This was around now 2016, 17. So I graduated 2012, spent 2.5 years in consulting, another 2.5 years in-house strategy at Visa. And of course, some of the cliches do hold. As you're a consultant, you do spend a lot of your time analyzing numbers, of course, like speaking to people. You become the expert of some things, but not necessarily everything. And you never go very, very deep into one particular topic and build up some expertise. You're also always in the position of coming up with a plan for something, but not then being responsible for the execution of it. So you don't, I mean, oftentimes I don't even know what happens after you create the strategy. Like you can go 2 years after, it's like, oh, I wonder what happened to that thing I was working on, which is a strange feeling sometimes when you're like, okay, you burn the long hours as well doing it. It's not like you're coasting 9 to 5. You're working longer hours. You're going really deep in something for a very short period of time. And for me, I felt like I wanted to get to the bottom, which is almost the reason why I left strategy consulting, which is strategy very generically for a company for a short period of time on a very specific question. And then you leave and you go to the next client. And then from that to in-house, where you're, of course, working in the same company, in the same industry, but then doing very specific projects. Well, I felt like I wanted to cut my teeth on something that goes from A to Z, like all the way through the life cycle. This was around the time, like product, I don't know how to phrase this, like product as a industry of its own, like as a sector was developing. So you had like really good product thinking now coming out into the open and it was becoming mass market. You have like the Silicon Valley companies, the people who spent time in those writing about product and what it means to be a good product manager or work on good products and what makes those products great and how to build those.
That's where the engineers, the developers, those who understand to build stuff, the so-called geeks almost became the cool kids.
Exactly. And so like product manager, like both like the rank of product manager probably during that like 2016 to 20, like went from like somewhere where you knew they existed, but there's not that many of them and you're not sure what they do, to like being like, whoa, everyone out of the top business school or like
they're
the
like
top
the
school.
rock stars.
Yeah, they're like the investment bankers of like 2007. Like, you know, it's like everyone wanted to be now product managers. And so I like to think of myself as like early in that cycle and trying to then think about myself and my skills and how I then take strategy and execute on it. And, you know, some of the ways you measure the success of a strategy is in the numbers, of course, but there's a whole process that you follow that you can also be really good at. And if you take the Silicon Valley like mentality at that point in time, like you can learn fast and fail. And so it's not just the numbers, it's almost like the process you go through is equally as important as the outcome. And of course, the outcome does matter. If you want to build great products, you need to do product right. But that like process of learning about it and pushing myself outside of my comfort zone again was like something I very specifically tried to put myself into that position for.
My partner's a consultant, and he always say like, either you're a consultant or you're not, because it is very much that you hand things over, and but you, to your point, you never see it coming to fruition. You don't see how you keep evolving and changing and developing new features or enhancement or failing fast, right? You never see the execution of that strategy.
And so like that's why I wanted to put myself in towards, and I think I've been through a journey in and of itself, like in product. So I joined Nets in 2017 in the product team, doing payment stuff in a new geography, so Scandinavia versus generally Europe for Visa Europe. And I was sort of in at the deep end to some extent. I've not been trained in product in any sense at that point in time. I just knew that I had a very specific knowledge of PSD2 regulation. Now, if you come from the payments industry, you might have heard that term before. But I knew it quite well. And therefore, I had to then build a product plan out of it and think about what it means for Nets to execute on this regulation from the product lens and what that meant for the roadmaps across different products and our different geographies and our customers. And I just started to slowly unpack one by one. Like some of the books, I know you can't see them, but there's like Hooked and there's like Lean Startup by Eric Ries and stuff like that. So I was like reading through it, but there's nothing quite like throwing yourself in and saying, oh, okay, cool. Like how do I interact with product managers? How do I interact with product owners? How do I get engineers to understand what I'm trying to explain that they should do? And of course, there's the agile methodologies. You follow those processes, but there's more than that. Your interactions with them are quite distinct and varied. And it's about learning that process to then make sure you're all on the same journey to the same outcome. And it's not always a given that that's true.
So you were on an extremely steep learning curve. And I wanted to ask you, because that must have been quite of a feeling to go in and you, as you say, like being on deep waters, right? were there a specific moment where you felt like you were really falling apart? Everything is just not going the way you were hoping, but also like, how did you turn it around?
Yeah. So self-awareness is like a really important skill in many dimensions, I would say, as you transition from being an individual in a team to being a leader of a team to maybe being a much larger in the whole business. You'll get to stages in your career where people will point that out for you, or sometimes you'll figure that out yourself. So I joined Nets in 2017, 5 years of strategy experience, just making, I'm simplifying it, just making slides and plans and working with business leaders to get things in place, but then not being responsible for what happens after. I joined Nets, and of course, the first thing you sort of need to do, this is a new area. I'm responsible for it. I'm the only person responsible for PSD2 implementation. So it's like, okay, great. Like I'm back where I belong. Sort of like vague thing. Need to create a plan and a vision for what we're going to do. Super comfortable.
Yeah.
Everything made sense. I'm like, okay, I'm going to spend like 2-3 months, understand the business, meet people, but then create this like master plan and strategy, which is great. Then you get to the end of that, then everyone buys into it. Maybe it wasn't 2-3 months, but 6 months process. You get to the end of that, then you're like, okay, now I need to plan for the execution. And you have this strategy that you've made, and then you try to transpose that into an execution. An execution that doesn't just make sense on a PowerPoint. So it's like a chart of like, yeah, really high level thing. Create the decision on what this customer portal should look like and what we need to do in the product team. And now I have to go to people who are going to build stuff and tell them what to do, and they need to understand it. And actually what I've written here doesn't make any sense to them because it's so vague. And they're going to ask me 50 questions on what that means. And then I'm going to use the wrong word. And then we're like, I don't understand what that means. Like, what do you mean? Can you explain that further? And so like, I get to this stage where I have to translate what I've said is the vision and the plan into something very tangible. I am not used to this like transposition and then being responsible for that transposition so that everyone is on the same page. And typically I'm now dealing with different stakeholders. So strategy is like business leaders and let's say H.Co and other strategy people, maybe people in finance, and they all roughly speak the same language. But other parts of the organization don't speak the same language when you're talking to other product managers, product owners, engineers, people responsible for security and risk and all of that sort of stuff. So I'm now faced with two things. One is probably the execution scale was much bigger than I anticipated it to be. Secondly, I need to translate everything that I thought was easy to understand to me as a strategy person into things that I can create alignment with for different stakeholders than I've previously dealt with. And so that self-awareness came like, oh, okay, like I can't operate like I used to. I can't word plans as I used to. I need to figure out the new way forward and how I create alignment. And I was working with a very good manager, so I could use him as like a mentor. And we took a step back and we said, okay, cool. Firstly, to get through the scale problem, we need to think of this as not Nabeel is responsible for, but we need to create a vehicle to execute. And oftentimes, I think I've used it more and more in my career. It's like think of projects as vehicles, and you need people on board. Let's call it a train at particular points in time. But you need to know who needs to be on there, when, and what they need to know and what they need to do. And so we created a program around PSD2, which was the thing I was working on ultimately, which was roughly in the end like 3.5 years of my career. So that's one way you overcame it. I think putting your hands up and saying to a manager, "Oh, I'm not sure the right way to take this forward. I'm a bit like stuck here." Yeah. So we created the vehicle. We designed something that we needed project manager, we needed a communications manager, we need someone who will deal with customers. So we got that structure in place. Then still came the second part of my problem, which is how do I adapt myself? And that's really a learning by doing. So it's like having as many conversations as possible with product managers and engineers, understanding what they do. So sometimes I'd go back to first principles. It's like, can I have a coffee with you? I just want to understand how you do this.
Yeah.
And then learning from those different types of conversations, things that the books can't really prepare you for.
Yeah.
And then going back into those conversations with a much sharper way of communicating with them and creating alignment with the different stakeholders so that they're on the same page as you in executing. Yeah. And one of the things I learned along the way was not that those things inhibited me from being creative and I pushed myself into a really rigid structure. Actually, the vehicle, so that creating a program out of what I needed to achieve, allowed me to be much more creative than I could before, with the comfort that there are people responsible for certain things and they're going to execute on it. And the fact that I could communicate better with the stakeholders that I needed to, and I needed to know when to interact with them and how to interact with them. Also led to better results, and ultimately, I did judge success by the numbers because we had really good approval when the regulation came into force. So if I could take like 10 seconds on explaining what I was trying to achieve, PSD2 regulation implemented one thing, which is like, or one of the main things was strong customer authentication. So every time you make a payment, you need to approve yourself. In Denmark, we use MitID or NemID as it was called then. In other countries, you can use an SMS and use the 6-digit code. We needed to ensure that our products were ready to deliver that every time a transaction came in that was applicable to the regulation, and that our customers, i.e. merchants in this case, knew what to do and that they had it implemented, and that their end consumers also were aware in some way, shape, or form that they had to do that along the purchase life cycle. So judging success for that was essentially by how many approved transactions you had, or the absence of large numbers of declined transactions. The numbers were good, and we got there in the end, but it was definitely a long journey to get there. 3 years, so it was literally a long journey.
It is a long journey.
But then also, like from my perspective, a strong learning journey as well.
Yeah. And I wanted to hear because, one thing is the self-realization that, okay, I have a gap here. I need to figure this out. How in heaven's name am I going to do this? How do I actually bring this fancy, glossy presentation strategy to life and execute on it? Rather that from a scalability perspective with your vehicle, or if it's language. From that experience, before we move on, I wanted to hear, were there certain aha moments that made you feel like, okay, either, Jesus, holy moly, I am not getting it, or wow, I just cracked the code?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of those. I will talk about one of them specifically, which was, and this is not like a rule for everyone, but what I found now navigating all the different companies that I've been in, sometimes less people in the meeting is more, as it's not groundbreaking, but there's a tendency, I think, in many companies, especially large ones, to create SteerCos and bring lots of people together to create decisions.
Yeah.
And I've become like really averse to that. So in my new role here at Odevo, where I lead embedded finance, trying to coalesce people into aligning with what you're trying to do and motivate them to an end goal, I think sometimes is much better done bilaterally. The reason you get lots of people together is you think you can hit the needle in one go. So you hit like bullseye in one go, and like 10 people all of a sudden from different roles understand what you're trying to achieve.
And often it's also like, we don't want to like hurt people's feelings. People should be heard. Yeah. Let's bring them in. And then it becomes this massive meeting. Or just like, do that single person have anything to say? Otherwise, maybe they shouldn't be there.
And it's like a trade-off, because let's say you need 5 stakeholders to agree or just be on board with something, a plan that you're creating. There's maybe someone from marketing, there's someone from legal, product and tech, finance, and maybe there's someone in the senior management. You could try to have them all in the same meeting. Well, that meeting is not necessarily relevant for everyone. So not the whole hour, let's say, you have is relevant for everyone. They all speak in different ways. And this is going back to the point I mentioned before about changing from speaking just to senior management about strategy work to speaking to product and engineering about getting things done. They don't all speak the same language. So you sometimes, one of two things can happen. One is like half the room just doesn't say anything at all and doesn't find it relevant. The other times, everyone wants to say something and ask you to elaborate on something. And like the agenda you thought you had is not the agenda you end up having. You balance that off with the fact that, okay, if you have 5 individual meetings with all of those stakeholders, you're using 5x the amount of time approximately than you would have used in one meeting, by finding it moves the project forward much more than one individual meeting with 5 stakeholders. So I think one of the things I consistently do differently now is like have an aversion to SteerCos. And if I have a SteerCo, it's not used to create or make decisions, but it's used to align on the decisions that have already been made bilaterally. It works most of the time, doesn't work all the time. But I think that's the way to go for me. So decisions bilaterally, and then align them.
For those who might not be familiar with the word SteerCo, just can you, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so it literally means like steering committee, which is essentially when you start a project, you identify people who should drive decisions, approve the direction, maybe. If there's blockers and obstacles, they're the ones who will tell you, okay, this is the way we should go about it, and we all agree. And typically you'll pick people from different functions, and they may be very senior people, and that has its own like implications. Either they're like very in tune and they have really good ideas, or they didn't read anything and then they come to the meeting and you sort of get derailed again.
They shouldn't be in it, should they?
Maybe not. I think what I've started to learn is you need to deal with different stakeholders, right?
Yeah.
Some need like 3 days in advance, like document. Some need like a 5-minute call the day before the meeting. Some you can trust completely to have read, pre-read, you send 24 hours. So each one is slightly different. Unfortunately, there's no rule. And I think I would do a little digression from there. Like, stakeholder management is extremely important. Like in large organizations for sure, but even in small organizations. So I've worked in like large enterprises, global enterprises like Visa, worked in multinational companies like Nets, and now work at Odevo, which is also international, by the way, but at a different scale. And knowing how to work with different types of people is super important. Knowing how to navigate them and bring them into projects when it's relevant, super important. So that's always true. And in SteerCo, that's especially true because you want to create the right dynamic, and having the right dynamic in steering committees is important. But you have to know what type of organization you're in, what type of people you've asked to be in the SteerCo, and what you want to use that SteerCo for. I don't like to use them for grand decision making anymore. I like to create individual decisions with people who I think are the most relevant, and then combine all of the decisions up and create alignment for it. So that's definitely something I do differently now.
What would you advise anyone who are about to start a project when it comes to understanding your stakeholders and speaking the right language? What would be your one advice?
I sort of list out the key decisions that need to be made, and I list out who is relevant to input to that singular decision. So what I try to do is create focus for that stakeholder I'm going to interact with. They don't necessarily always need the full context. They don't necessarily need to be involved in every decision or input to every single outcome. But what you want to do is make that job as easy as possible for them. So give them as much information as they need as you're designing a project when you're selecting the stakeholders you need involved. Select when you need to speak to them and give them enough information that they can help you come to the decision that you need, without necessarily cluttering them with too much noise. And I think in the end, if you add up the stakeholders like that after breaking it down, I think you usually get to better outcomes quicker. Not 100% of the time, but I think often it tends to lend itself to a better speed and efficiency of outcome than trying to have everyone in on the same story.
I very much agree with you, and I've had similar experiences as well. I did a similar approach. I did one-to-ones, and I stood each single executive leader and then had the group sign off. And I wanted to tell me about that time where you got super surprised of the outcome, and now you're talking about this speed of execution. What has been some of your early learnings so far?
Come with like domain knowledge. That's why I joined this company. Okay, I'm in embedded finance. I come mostly from a payments background, but I know things about banking as a service and insurance and lending and stuff like that, although those aren't my specialities. You need to remove that baggage somewhat when you're the expert or supposed expert in something. So coming from a strategy background and a payments background, if I have payments problems to solve in the new company, I typically go from like a set structure that I know. Okay, cool. I've worked in product in payments too, but so I'm like coming at things from a very particular approach, and I realize that I create noise for myself. So I go like too much into detail on very specific things, but it's sort of natural because you come from that background. It's almost like your bread and butter to go into those details, but the details aren't necessarily what's important here to drive the decision. So I definitely think one of the things I'm learning and surprise myself is how little I need to explain stuff to get stuff done.
Yeah. You don't have to explain stuff. Oh, that's so lovely.
It's almost like you're comforting yourself that you've been through this process of explaining stuff, and people, now you've upskilled someone into like the history of payments and how payments works around the world.
Yes.
And then you can make a decision. But actually sometimes now I'm like skipping a lot of the context. And like, this is what I want to achieve. This is what I want to do, and here's why.
Yeah.
And it might not even be slides anymore. It's literally just an email. or it's like, hey, can I borrow you for 10 minutes? Like, you don't need to frame everything as a really important decision or a forum or an intro meeting. It's like, hey, can I have 5 minutes of your time? I heard you know about this. Like, I just wanted to know, or I need to figure this out. Can you help me? And so like, that's one of the things that I'm surprising myself at. Like, I'm now operating very differently than I did before.
Why
Again,
do you
part of
think
it's like
that is?
cultural. I think one is the environment. I think I was just about to touch on like culture of a company
Sorry.
can be quite different. No, you almost read my mind. So culture is, I think, quite important. Like the environment you're operating in. I think people will be used to operate a different way. I think there's also a shift between like enterprise versus scale up. Let's say that's part of the cultural difference.
Yeah.
I think also moving from industry. So I'm working in the payments industry as a payments person. Content is like what you rely on. Like expertise is what you rely on. Outside of that, you're the only person who cares about payments, really. Of course, you want to make it easy for the customer and you want to deliver something that's a good solution at the end product, but you're the only person that cares about payments in that much detail. So what actually matters to the person is nothing really to do with payments. It's like what we're trying to achieve as an end outcome for the customer. I think those two things have like really shifted my perspective. So like I'm in a different environment, the speed of movement, the way things get done, the way decisions are made, the amount of input people are comfortable with making a decision from is also very different. And then the second thing is that the content or the details don't matter so much to everyone else like they did before.
Do you think it's also because of there is a higher tolerance to risk?
I think it's one of two things. In my head, I don't put it down to risk. I put it down to trust. So it's almost like the other side of the coin. Like, why would there be risk? Because you don't feel like you know everything, or you can trust the person who's giving you the information.
That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah. So I think it's about trust. I think people trust you. It's like, you don't need to convince us that like this is 100%, like the 120% the right thing to do by giving us a 50-page slides on why we should use this payment service provider. I think give us what we need to know, the impact and what outcomes it will drive for the customer and why it would be good for us and what's the business model. And that's about enough. So it's also adapting the way I interact with, let's say, vendors and stuff. I do, of course, all the same due diligence, like people who could be partners for us, let's say in payments or banking, but also realizing what I need to know from them in order to make the decisions I need to make. Again, it's about knowing what you need from people, and not in a negative way, in a positive way, without creating confusion.
Yeah. And it kind of triggers me to ask this question. Have you had any pain that through your career that now have served you really well, thinking back?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that initial. So if I go back to my career, Nets, we talked about like the product challenges, going from strategy to product. The funny thing is, like, I combined those two in my next role at Nets, which was product strategy. So I did strategy, product strategy, and then strategy again. And now I'm in something that's less competency focused, is just embedded finance solutions. I think moving into product strategy, I was facing that vagary around like creating long-term plans for the roadmap without being responsible for it. And so a part of the pain I went through, again, after having worked in product, was being visionary at the same time as being specific. And that's something that took a long time for me to get right. A long time, maybe I was only in the role for like 2 years. So, a few months worth of time before I actually figured out how to do it. And that was one of the first occasions where I started to change the way I interact with management. And so I did two things differently. One is I had SteerCos, or like monthly forum, let's say monthly product strategy forum. And then we removed them because they weren't working. Because we would create, it ended up being like a normal strategy team. We would create strategic views on something for the management team that would just satisfy the management team, but not necessarily inform product decisions. So we stopped doing that. The other thing I started to do differently was move away from PowerPoint into writing Word documents. I know it's famous because Amazon has been doing it for a long time.
I was just about to say.
They're famous 6 pages. But I found that writing Word documents as a tool to create alignment versus PowerPoint or versus like monthly forums was a lot more effective, because I could write, when you write prose, like you're able to explain things a lot better than you could if you're PowerPoints, because you keep jumping between pages in PowerPoint, and each page should have its own unique point to it. And it's like, my career has considered being about like throwing myself into something and then figure out what's the right way to do it a little bit along the way. And I think one of the things I struggled with at the start of being someone who's responsible for product strategy, which is the intersection of two things, is trying to meet two different sets of requirements and figuring out what the best way to do that. It's not the same way I did strategy, and it's not necessarily the same way I was working in the product team either. It's something in between. And having very singular meetings with different product managers, and then writing documents for them and for the management team to create alignment was something I did. And there were a few other things as well I did differently. For example, not surfacing every decision back to management. It sounds like scary, like I'm creating some sort of secret or something, but it's not necessarily. I think you can solve a lot of things locally. Again, sometimes it's your need for visibility, or your need for showing your working to management, that you say, oh, look, now this is what we've done and this is why we should do it. But actually, a lot of times things can be made locally, and it's probably only a few very big decisions that require management input. So you should be conscious of those too, not creating an overhead for yourself where you need forums or you need decisions, and then you have dependencies and calendars get in the way, and then you go to someone who's senior and they say, I look at this slightly differently. You need to go away and do like 3 weeks more worth of analysis. When in your head, sometimes you leave those meetings thinking, I'm not sure I need to do 3 weeks worth of analysis. I don't think I need to answer that question.
Yeah.
But you have to do it now because you put
yourself in that situation.
Exactly. So like, yeah. And I think oftentimes management are quite receptive for you to say no. Like, no. And I think that's another thing I learned during this product strategy process was, no, I don't think we need to do that analysis. I think we have comfort and enough experience and knowledge in the product team or the sales team from having spoken to customers that this is the right thing to do. We don't necessarily have to model everything, or we don't have to do XYZ market analysis or competitor analysis before we should feel comfortable making a decision. I think you can push your management team often to use that expertise that already exists in the company and to rely on that, to trust. Again, like the word I mentioned before, they might feel they're taking a risk, but I think the key word is like, do you trust what we're saying and the expertise we have in-house? And I think that those are the two things, like altering the form of communication and then pushing back where you need to.
I think it's really important because, to your point with trust, as you just said, that's why they hired you. You are the expert. They believe that you can carry the organization to that next level, or carry those executions and projects to life, right? And sometimes leaders also feel the urge of verbalizing their thoughts or opinions, because it might also not look great for them to sit quietly and nod along in a meeting.
Yeah. And there you're challenging the status quo, like almost like the cultural need for doing certain things and getting things done. So you're almost like ticking a box, like, have we done this so that we can make a decision?
What would you say make up a good founder or leader in today's world?
One thing that I found always useful when a leader, not necessarily always a founder, but a leader has told me, is that they're able to describe, I'm going to use the word singular. It doesn't necessarily only mean like one single thing, but like it could be one or two things that we're trying to achieve as a company, and then trusting you to figure out exactly what that means for you.
Yeah.
And not all leaders do that. So they will hire, I won't say names, like a management consultant, say, oh, this is what the next 5 years of this company looks like. And here's 150 pages that we've paid for that describe that like end to end. And often that's way more confusing than anything simple. It makes people feel like they have a massive task and sort of saps the creativity out of them. So I feel like the best leaders I've worked with are able to describe a purpose and then trust you to do it. And that I'm not necessarily talking about a catchy tagline, like, but like it has to be something that encapsulates what you're trying to achieve for your customers. And I feel like then the other good thing that good leaders do is create the platform for you to go and solve that, then remove the noise from you to take you away from things that you don't need to focus on.
Yeah.
I would say like bad leadership looks like messy organizations with unclear responsibility, people not clear on why they need to do certain things, and then them needing to increasingly get more micromanagey to be able to solve for that.
Yeah.
Because the best leaders are able to give you the platform to solve that. And if they trust you, they trust their hiring, then you can get to the best outcome with the most clarity. And sometimes tunnel vision is a little bit good. Like if you're in there to solve one specific type of problem, the fact that you have the ability to have tunnel vision on an outcome actually is probably a good thing.
When we look ahead, what's one of the things you believed in 10 years ago that you have stopped believing in today, and why?
I think something I believed in before is that the content of what you do makes the most difference. So the strength of your analysis or the quality of the logic of your presentation or your vision or your strategy is the most important thing. I would switch that now. Of course, 10 years ago, I was quite early in my career. So what did I even know then? But if I look back now, I definitely think, when you're early in your career, and it's natural, you rely on your skill and the content of your work to get you further. As I've got more and more experience, I would say it's not the content that matters, it's how you use it. So it's the way you interact with the stakeholders, the way you navigate the company, how you're able to motivate other people towards a shared outcome is actually the most important thing. So like, I definitely think that content is important, but I, as a more experienced person, rely much less on content and slides and analysis and charts and things like that than really detailed tables of things. Exactly. And it's about being adaptable to the environment. I think if you just rely on your content, you're not really adapting to who's in front of you or what the project is. I think being able to think about what's required at that point in time with that particular stakeholder, I think that's common. I probably said that like 5 times on this call. I really think it makes a big difference. I think at least for me, like that's the most important thing that I keep learning is like how to interact with different stakeholders. And as you join new companies, you meet new people, and that's why it's probably fresh in my mind. It's like, oh, okay, cool. Like I'm meeting this person, they like doing things this way. Another person, like this is how I work with them best. Get that? So it's not the content. I feel like it's how you use it, and sometimes that's not using content at all.
Very smart. And we're living in this crazy world. Things move extremely fast.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say is a rule in your sector or your industry that you would love to see broken?
That's so interesting. Payments is a tricky one. You can't break many rules. It's very highly regulated, I would say. But but outside of that, I mean, one of the things, like, I'm not sure if it totally answers your question, Christie, but I would say, like, there's a lot of talk right now about AI and pushing the boundaries and like agentic commerce and things like that. One of the things that I've been thinking about, not necessarily related to my day job, but it's just on the side of it, is the fact that it sort of leads to my point, like regulation is coming more and more into payments. And so like what tends to happen in industries is that you try to build ahead, like 2 steps ahead, and then regulation sort of pulls you 1 step back. I think what's becoming increasingly important these days is trying to build for regulation. So it's almost like preempting what the regulation could be. And I feel like there's often an industry created after regulation is announced, but if you could be the first mover in that space, I always feel like there's a lot to take advantage of. So yeah, if I could say like, it's not necessarily a rule to break, but something that our industry could think about is building for regulation before it comes, and trying to preempt that and not necessarily trying to break the boundaries and then work back after regulation puts some restrictions on that. That's at least how I've been thinking. If I would come up with a crazy startup idea at some point in time, I would probably look at like what regulators are talking about and then try to fit into that. The regulation life cycle actually quite long. Like they start with like a draft of something and then it goes through consultation and the industry bodies and then they edit it and then they launch it. And the launch timeline probably has like 18 to 24 months, at least in Europe. So yeah, I would say like, building for regulation could be a good thing.
I like that. I think that there's definitely something to that. And moving swiftly on, because I'm realizing we are nearly out of time. Question.
Mm-hmm.
Uncomfortable truth people should act on today.
Uncomfortable truths people should act on today. One of the things that goes through my head is like, it's okay to say no upwards, but actually I would change that and say, not everyone needs to be involved in a decision to make the decision a good one. I think you really need to be precise on whose input is the most important, and that will get you there quicker. That's one of the uncomfortable truths, I guess, because as I mentioned before, you typically want to have a wide representation of different types of people when you make a decision, but I don't necessarily think that's true. And that might mean you make some decisions, at least that don't have a significant business impact, not at the management level, but actually down in the business. And then other times you may want to only speak to certain people to make a decision. So you don't need that much input to make decisions and get things done.
Get things done. I love it. What is something you are doubling down on right now and that you believe others should urgently pay attention to before it's too late?
I think one of the things that I spend a lot of my time on the side is a little bit related to what we talked about in AI, is trying to figure out like what are the things happening around me in different, and finance is like so broad, especially embedded finance. It's a booming industry, so there's so many other things happening, but I'm like a prolific subscriber to like Substacks, things like that. On the weekend, I read a lot around things happening in the industry, whether it's banking or fintech or payments specifically, where I've spent a lot of my time in my career. So I'm doubling down on being as aware of the ecosystem that's happening around me as much as possible, and making sure that I'm future-proof to some extent. Like I know what the next thing is that's happening in payments or the next thing in banking, and taking learnings from others who've done things and built things and being able to try to apply those myself in the industry. I think the pace of change is hard to keep up with if you isolate yourself. Like you become out of date in 6 months if you've not looked at what's happening outside. And as the pace of change with AI continues to grow faster and faster, I think it makes sense to make sure that as an individual in a company, in any industry, you're aware of what's happening out there and how things in your industry are changing, but also the tools you could use in your industry are changing over time.
Totally second that. Nadeem, you and I could continue. We are 7 minutes past our time. It's the first time it had happened in this podcast history. Oh. So I do apologize, but I really appreciate your time this evening. Thank you so much for joining Pantrium.
No worries. It's been great sharing with you.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you have feedback, topic ideas, or guest recommendations, we are all ears. Pantrium is growing thanks to our community of listeners. So if something resonated with you, we would love for you to share your favorite takeaways. And just a quick note. The views shared by our guests are entirely their own and don't necessarily reflect the companies they work for. That's it for now. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time.